Obese teen about to be sold like cattle until a giant Apache thundered. "She's having my son." The dusty street falls silent. A drunken father shoves his trembling daughter onto the auction block, offering her for whiskey as the crowd turns away in shame. The church bell tolls, the sheriff's hand rests on his gun, and just when all hope seems lost, a towering figure steps forward, stopping the sale with 5 shocking words. But this sudden rescue is no simple mercy. The town whispers of scandal. The railroad men sharpen their knives, and even the preacher fears the marriage that could tear the whole community apart. Behind cabin doors, a fragile bond begins to grow between a broken girl and the warrior who vowed to protect her. Yet outside, enemies gather ready to brand their love a crime. Will faith and courage be enough to turn disgrace into redemption? Or will the frontier swallow them both before the truth can be heard? Every story begins with a heartbeat. Tell me, where are you in the world today, and how are you really doing? Your words make this space feel more human. The Colorado sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty street, turning the wooden planks of Miller's saloon into a makeshift furnace. Abby Johnson stumbled forward as her father's iron grip yanked her arm, his whiskey-soured breath making her stomach turn. The rough boards of the saloon porch creaked under their feet as he dragged her toward the crude auction block. Really? Just a stack of empty crates pushed against the wall. "Time to earn your keep, girl," he slurred, shoving her forward. Abby's cheeks burned as red as the setting sun. She kept her eyes fixed on her worn boots, watching dust motes dance in the golden afternoon light. Her arms instinctively wrapped around her middle, as if she could somehow make herself smaller, less visible to the growing crowd. The townsfolk gathered like vultures, their shadows stretching long across the packed dirt street. A few ranch hands elbowed each other, snickering behind dirty palms. The women who'd gathered at the general store across the way huddled together, some whispering in horror, others averting their eyes in silent shame. $10. Her father bellowed, swaying slightly. "Who'll give me $10 for this worthless lump of a girl? Might not be much to look at, but she can cook and clean better than most." Abby's heart hammered against her ribs. Silent tears tracked down her cheeks as she heard the first jeering calls from the crowd. This was it. She'd be sold off like a piece of livestock, traded for enough whiskey to keep her father soaked for a month. $8, someone called out. $7.50. Another voice challenged, followed by cruel laughter. "Going cheap," her father roared, like cattle to market. The late afternoon air grew thick with tension and tobacco smoke. Abby's prayers seemed to echo in her head, desperate pleas for deliverance that had gone unanswered so many times before. But this time, something changed. A sudden hush fell over the crowd. The very air seemed to still, as if nature itself held its breath. Heavy bootsteps approached, measured and deliberate, accompanied by the soft jingle of spurs. Abby raised her eyes just enough to see moccasins and buckskin-clad legs step into view. Her gaze traveled upward, taking in the imposing figure of a native warrior. He stood head and shoulders above the crowd, his dark eyes sharp as obsidian. A long scar traced down one side of his face, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. Despite his intimidating presence, there was something in his expression that spoke of deep dignity rather than threat. "She is not cattle," the warrior's voice rang out, clear and strong. His English was precise, each word carefully chosen. "She is carrying my son." The crowd erupted in gasps and mutters. Ladies fanned themselves furiously, while men shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. Abby's mouth fell open in shock as she stared at the stranger. She had never seen him before in her life, yet here he was, claiming more than just her. Her father's face turned from ruddy to purple. What nonsense is this? I never seen you near my girl." The warrior who would later introduce himself as Dakota stepped closer. Though he moved with fluid grace, there was no mistaking the coiled strength in his frame. "The child she carries is of my blood. I claim them both by right and honor." More whispers rippled through the crowd. Abby stood frozen, her mind spinning. Like a dust devil. She wasn't with child. She knew that as surely as she knew her own name. But something in Dakota's steady gaze told her to stay silent, to trust in whatever strange destiny was unfolding. "You're lying," her father spat, but his voice wavered. Even drunk, he seemed to sense the dangerous ground he tread upon. "Dakota's Hand came to rest on the knife at his belt, not a threat, but a reminder. Would you question my honor? Would you deny my claim to my own blood? The townsfolk shifted nervously. Everyone knew the stories of Apache warriors and their fierce protection. A family. Even those who might normally hurl insults or challenge such a claim held their tongues, unwilling to risk the consequences. I, her father stammered, his grip on her arm finally loosening. But she ain't worth nothing without a proper bride. Price. Dakota reached into a leather pouch at his waist and withdrew a handful of silver dollars. They caught the light as he held them out. $20. More than fair for a father who would sell his own daughter. The coin seemed to hypnotize her father, his bloodshot eyes fixed on them, already calculating how many bottles they would buy. With a grunt, he snatched the money and released Abby's arm entirely. Take her then, he muttered. Good riddance to bad weight. Dakota stepped forward, placing himself between Abby and her father. His presence felt like a shield, solid and reassuring. Come, he said softly to her, his voice gentled from the stern tones he'd used before. He offered his hand, palm up, not grabbing, not demanding, but inviting. Abby stared at that weathered palm, her heart thundering in her ears. Behind her lay everything she'd ever known, bitter and painful as it was. Before her stood a stranger, an unknown future, and a lie that had somehow become her salvation. With trembling fingers, she placed her hand in his dot. His skin was warm and calloused, his grip firm but careful. Without another word, he led her down the steps of the saloon porch. The crowd parted before them like water around a stone. Some people still whispered, others gaped openly, but none dared to interfere. As they walked away from the saloon, Abby felt the afternoon sun on her face in a way she never had before. Each step took her further from the auction block, from her father's cruelty, from a fate she'd thought inescapable. She didn't know where Dakota was leading her or what would happen next, but for the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Hope. The sharp jangle of spurs cut through the murmuring crowd as Sheriff Matthew Cole strode forward, his badge catching the late afternoon sun. His weathered face held the careful neutrality of a man used to walking delicate lines between justice and peace. Now hold on here, the sheriff said, positioning himself between Dakota and the still fuming father. This is a serious claim you're making, mister. We need some answers before anyone goes anywhere. Abby's knees trembled beneath her skirts as she stood beside Dakota, his tall frame casting a protective shadow over her. The crowd pressed closer, eager for drama, while her father swayed on his feet, clutching his silver dollars. She is my betrothed, Dakota stated, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had silenced the auction. I claim her under my protection, as is my right. Her father's face twisted with rage. Ain't no right to it. She's worthless, always has been. Just dead weight eating my food, taking up space. His words slurred together as he jabbed a finger in their direction. And now she's gone and sullied herself with. That's enough, Sheriff Cole cut him off, raising a hand. His eyes narrowed as he studied Dakota. You understand what you're saying? What it means to this town? The gathered crowd shifted and muttered among themselves. Near the back, a group of railroad workers spoke in harsh whispers, their faces dark with disapproval. Apache blood has no place here, one spat, loud enough to be heard, but others in the crowd seemed less certain. Mrs. Miller, the baker's wife, nodded slowly. Better than seeing her sold like livestock, she said to her neighbor. Did you see how her father treated her, like she wasn't even human? The girl needed saving, another woman agreed softly. Even if it's from, well, before more could be said, Reverend Thomas stepped forward from the crowd, his black coat marking him as clearly as the sheriff's badge. The preacher's lined face was stern as he addressed Dakota directly. If what you claim is true, he said, each word measured and clear, then there is only one honorable path forward. You must wed the girl properly, before sundown, in the house of God. He glanced at the setting sun. To protect her honor, and that of our town. Our town. Dakota inclined his head slightly. I accept these terms. Abby's heart fluttered like a trapped bird. She turned to look up at him, her voice barely a whisper. But I don't know you. Dakota looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw something soften in his dark eyes. You will, he said quietly, just for her ears. The simple words carried a weight of promise that made her breath catch. Her father's curse shattered the moment. "Devil take you both," he snarled, already stumbling toward the saloon with his blood money. "Ain't no daughter of mine anymore." Several of the town's women moved forward then, led by Mrs. Miller. They surrounded Abby like a flock of protective hens. Clucking and fussing, Mrs. Miller draped a soft wool shawl around Abby's shoulders. "Come now, dear," she said kindly. "Let's get you ready. Can't have you married in a work dress." As the women guided her toward the Miller home, Abby felt Dakota fall into step beside them. He moved with silent grace, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of whispers and stares that followed their strange procession through town. The next few hours passed in a blur of gentle hands and hushed voices. The women cleaned her face, brushed her hair, and found her a simple but clean dress that had belonged to Mrs. Miller's daughter. Through it all, Dakota waited outside, a patient sentinel dot. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they made their way to the small white church at the edge of town. The wooden steps creaked under their feet as they entered. Whispers rippled through the gathered townsfolk who filled the pews, some out of support, others from morbid curiosity. At the altar, Reverend Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his Bible clutched tight in his hands. He looked between Dakota and Abby, then glanced at the rear of the church where several railroad men stood with dark expressions. "I must warn you both," the preacher said in low tones. "The railroad has plans for this town. They want no Apache ties here. This marriage could bring ruin, not just to you, but to others." Dakota stood unmoved, like a mountain facing a breeze. His scarred face showed no fear, no doubt. The Creator's law stands above man's greed. The preacher studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He turned to Abby, his eyes gentle with concern. "And you, child? This is your choice to make. Do you wish to wed this man?" Abby looked down at her hands, which hadn't stopped trembling since the auction block. In the space of one afternoon, her whole world had turned upside down. Yet when she looked up at Dakota, she saw something in his steady gaze that she'd never known before: respect. Here was a man who had claimed her not as property to be bought, but as someone worthy of protection. Her voice was soft but clear as she answered, "Yes." Inside the small church, lamplight flickered across worn wooden pews, casting long shadows on whitewashed walls. The brass oil lamps sputtered and swayed, their light catching the wrinkles in Abby's borrowed dress. Her face was blotched and tear-stained, her hands trembling as she stood before the altar. Beside her, Dakota's presence remained steady as a mountain. His ceremonial shirt, adorned with careful beadwork, caught the warm light as he gently steadied her arm. The touch, though foreign, somehow anchored her in the whirlwind of this strange evening. Reverend Thomas cleared his throat, his Bible creaking as he opened it. The pages rustled in the hushed church as he searched for the proper verses. His hesitation was plain on his face, but at last he straightened his shoulders and began to read. "Dearly beloved," he started, his voice carrying through the church, despite its slight tremor. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God." The words washed over Abby like water, familiar yet distant. She'd heard these same vows spoken at other weddings, always from the safety of a back pew. Now they were meant for her, binding her to the stranger who had saved her from shame. A sudden bang made her jump. Her father had lurched to his feet, face twisted with disgust. His boots thundered against the wooden floor as he stormed down the aisle. The church door slammed behind him with such force that the windows rattled, and several of the women gasped. Reverend Thomas paused only briefly before continuing, though his voice shook slightly. "Do you, Dakota, take this woman?" Dakota's "I do" came clear and strong, without hesitation. When it was Abby's turn, she had to swallow twice before she could speak. I do," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then by the power vested in me," the preacher said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." A heavy silence fell over the church, broken only by the soft hiss of the oil lamps. Then came the murmurs, disapproving whispers that rippled through the pews like prairie wind through grass. Several of the railroad men stood and walked out, their boot heels striking the floor like judgment. Dakota seemed unmoved by it all. He simply reached down and clasped Abby's hand in his larger one, his grip gentle but firm. Without a word, He led her back down the aisle, past the staring faces and whispered comments. The night air hit Abby's face like a blessing as they stepped outside. Above them, the sky had deepened to indigo, with the first stars beginning to pierce through. A cool breeze carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her as they reached the bottom of the church steps. "Why?" she asked, her voice catching. "Why did you save me?" Dakota turned to face her, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "Because the Creator showed me you would be my wife," he said simply, as if stating an obvious truth like sunrise or winter snow. Before she could respond, he lifted her easily onto his waiting Mustang, a strong bay with white socks. The horse stood quietly as Dakota swung up behind her, gathering the reins in one hand while his other arm steadied her. They rode out of town at an easy lope, the horse's hoofbeats echoing off the false front buildings. Abby watched as the familiar structures, the general store, the smithy, the saloon where everything had changed, faded into prairie shadow behind them. They traveled in silence as the moon rose, its silver light painting the rolling grassland in shades of pearl and shadow. Abby's mind whirled with the day's events, but the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and Dakota's solid presence behind her gradually calmed her racing thoughts. When they finally stopped, it was at a small homestead nestled against a grove of cottonwoods. A rough-hewn cabin stood dark against the star-filled sky, with a lean-to nearby for horses. The sound of a creek murmured somewhere in the darkness. Dakota helped her down, her legs stiff from the ride. While she stood uncertainly in the yard, he efficiently cared for his horse, removing the tack and turning the animal into the lean-to, where another horse nickered a greeting. Soon a warm glow spilled from the cabin's window as Dakota lit a fire in the stone hearth. The interior was simple but clean, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a few shelves holding provisions, and a bed with a colorful blanket woven in geometric patterns. "Sit," Dakota said, gesturing to one of the chairs. He moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, bringing out dried meat, bread, and a pot of tea. He set a plate before her, not with the grudging obligation she was used to from her father, but with the natural courtesy of someone sharing with an honored guest. "Eat," he encouraged when she hesitated. The ride was long. The food was simple but good, and Abby hadn't realized how hungry she was until she took the first bite. Dakota ate with her in companionable silence, pouring her more tea when her cup ran low. Later, as she lay on the bed wrapped in the colorful blanket, Dakota had insisted she take it while he made a pallet by the fire. Abby stared at the moonlit window. The events of the day seemed almost dreamlike. The horror of the auction block, Dakota's unexpected intervention, the hasty wedding, and now this strange new place that was supposedly her home. Yet unlike the fearful dreams that usually plagued her nights, this one held an unfamiliar feeling, something like hope. For the first time in her memory, she was being treated not as a burden to be endured, but as someone who belonged. The fire crackled softly, its light dancing on the cabin's log walls. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, and another answered. Abby listened to Dakota's steady breathing from his place near the hearth, wondering what tomorrow would bring in this new life that had begun so unexpectedly. Dawn crept through the cabin's single window, painting the rough-hewn walls with pale golden light. Abby stirred beneath the colorful blanket, awakened by the sharp scent of wood smoke drifting in from outside. The rhythmic thud of an axe split the morning quiet. She sat up slowly, her borrowed dress wrinkled from sleep. Through the window, she could see Dakota's tall form already at work chopping kindling. His movements were steady and practiced, each stroke precise. Looking around the cabin in the clear morning light, Abby took in her new home. Everything was spare but meticulously kept. No dust gathered in the corners, no cobwebs stretched between the rafters. A few clay pots lined the shelves alongside. Basic provisions. A rifle hung on pegs above the door. This was clearly a place built for survival rather than comfort. Her stomach churned with nervous energy as she moved to the iron cookstove. Opening the pantry, she found eggs nestled in a basket, likely from the few chickens she'd glimpsed in the yard. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked. Was she truly his wife now? What did he expect of her? When Dakota came in, bringing with him the crisp morning air and the scent of fresh-cut wood, Abby had managed to prepare a simple breakfast of eggs and cornbread. She set his plate before him with uncertain movements. "Thank you," he said, his deep voice gentle. The words were simple but carried genuine appreciation. They ate in silence for a few moments before Dakota spoke again. "I should tell you of my past," he said, his eyes distant. "Years ago, I had a wife, Nami, and a son." His voice carried both sorrow and dignity as he continued. "When the soldiers came, they did not care that we had signed treaties. They burned our village. Many died. That day," Abby sat awkwardly, her own plate forgotten. She didn't know what to say, but something in his measured tone made her listen carefully. Beneath his strong exterior, she could sense deep wells of pain. "I am sorry," she managed finally, the words feeling inadequate. Dakota nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy. "The past is past. But you should know why I live here, between two worlds." As the sun climbed higher, Dakota led her outside. The morning air was cool and sweet with the scent of grass. He showed her around the small homestead, the chicken coop, the lean-to where the horses dozed, the tools needed for daily life. In the afternoon, he took her to a clear stream that ran through his land. The water chattered over rocks, feeding a small plot where corn grew in neat rows. Dragonflies darted above the surface like living jewels. "This land is fragile," he said, crouching to let water run through his fingers. "Always contested. The white settlers push from the east. Other tribes claim hunting rights." He stood, looking out over the rolling prairie. "But it is home now." Abby watched the water swirl past, gathering her courage. "Do you," she hesitated, then pressed on. "Do you really believe I will bear your son?" Dakota turned to face her fully. "The Spirit showed me," he said with quiet certainty. "You were chosen." Shame flooded through her as she looked down at herself, her heavy body that her father had mocked so often. How could someone like her be chosen for anything? She wrapped her arms around herself, hiding. Evening found them back in the cabin. The fire crackling in the hearth cast dancing shadows on the walls. Without quite meaning to, Abby found herself humming a hymn her mother used to sing before she died, "Amazing Grace." The familiar melody brought comfort, reminding her of gentler times. Dakota sat nearby, working on mending a bridle. His strong hands moved steadily with the leather as he listened to her quiet singing. After a while, he set his work aside. His hand came to rest on the rough wooden table, close to where hers lay, not quite touching but near enough that she could feel its warmth. The fire popped and sparked. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the gathering dusk. Abby's humming faded into silence, but the peace of the moment lingered. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt something like belonging beginning to take root in her heart. She glanced at Dakota's profile, strong and dignified in the firelight. His grief was evident in the set of his shoulders, the shadows in his eyes when he spoke of his lost family. Yet there was also faith there, faith strong enough to see visions, to claim a stranger as his wife, to believe in new beginnings. Abby didn't understand it all yet. She wasn't sure she believed she could be what he thought she was. But sitting there in the quiet evening, with the hymn's echoes still hanging in the air and Dakota's hand resting near hers, she felt the first delicate stirrings of trust beginning to form between them. Morning sunlight streamed across the cabin floor as Abby moved about the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. Through the window, she could see Dakota in the distance, his tall form bent over broken fence posts. The steady rhythm of his hammer drifted through the air. She wiped her damp palms on her skirts, trying to settle her nerves. Everything still. Felt strange, the cabin, her new role as wife, the quiet man outside who had saved her from shame. The wooden spoon moved mechanically through the pot of beans she was preparing, her mind elsewhere. The water barrel was running low. Abby glanced at the heavy ceramic jug by the door, then back at Dakota working in the heat. After a moment's hesitation, she filled the jug and lifted it carefully. The packed earth was warm beneath her feet as she made her way toward the fence line. Dakota looked up at her approach, sweat glistening on his bronze skin. He accepted the water with a nod of thanks, drinking deeply. As he lowered the jug, his dark eyes studied her thoughtfully. "You have never ridden a horse," he said. It wasn't a question. Abby shook her head, looking down. "Pa never let me near them." "Would you like to learn?" She glanced up, startled. "Me?" Dakota was already moving toward the lean-to where his Mustang dozed in the shade. The horse lifted its head as he approached, nickering softly. "Everyone should know the freedom of riding," he said, leading the animal out with gentle hands. "Even those who have been caged." Abby's heart thundered as Dakota adjusted the saddle and bridle. The Mustang seemed enormous up close, its muscles rippling beneath sleek hide. When Dakota motioned her forward, she took a step back. I can't," she stammered. "I'll fall." "You won't fall." His voice was calm, certain. "I will walk beside you." With trembling fingers, Abby gathered her skirts. Dakota's strong hands lifted her carefully, settling her in the saddle. She clutched the horn, her knuckles white with fear. "Breathe, Dakota," reminded her softly. "Feel his movement. Let your body follow." The Mustang began walking, guided by Dakota's lead. Each step made Abby bounce slightly, but true to his word, Dakota stayed close, his presence steady and reassuring. Gradually, her death grip on the saddle horn loosened as they circled the clearing. The horse's gait smoothed into a gentle lope. The wind kissed Abby's face, tugging at her hair. Something unfamiliar bubbled up inside her, a lightness she had almost forgotten existed. Suddenly, she was laughing. The sound surprised her, bright and clear and real. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like this, free and unafraid. Dakota's eyes crinkled at the corners, a small smile playing at his lips as he watched her discover this new joy. They continued until the sun hung low in the sky, Abby's confidence growing with each circle of the clearing. Later, back in the cabin, Abby stirred a pot of rabbit stew. Her legs ached pleasantly from the riding lesson, but her movements were steadier now, more purposeful. The herbs she'd found in Dakota's stores filled the air with a savory aroma. When she set the bowl before him, Dakota inhaled appreciatively. "You have skill with cooking," he said after tasting it. His quiet smile of approval made her cheeks flush warm. No one had praised her cooking before. Her father had only ever complained. No matter how hard she tried as they ate, Dakota spoke of his people's ways. His deep voice painted pictures of Apache life, of women respected as life givers, of the sacred duty of keeping the hearth, of families bound together by honor and tradition. "In our way," he explained, "women are the strength of the people. Without them, there is no future, no home, no heart in the community." Abby listened, spoon forgotten in her hand. All her life, she had been told she was worthless, too big, too quiet, too much of a burden. But Dakota spoke of women with such respect, such conviction. After supper, they sat outside in the gathering dusk. Fireflies rose from the grass like tiny stars dancing on the evening breeze. The air was soft with cricket song. "You are not weak," Dakota said suddenly, his voice gentle but firm. "Your strength is like water underground, hidden but very real." Tears welled in Abby's eyes, spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. "No one," she whispered, her voice catching, "no one has ever told me I was worth anything before." Dakota remained where he was, giving her space to weep. No rough hand seized her, no angry voice berated her tears. There was only understanding in his silence. "In this house," he said finally, "you will never be shamed. This is my promise to you. Abby wiped her eyes, looking out at the fireflies weaving through the darkness. For the first time since her mother died, hope flickered to life inside her, fragile as the tiny lights, but just as real. The next 3 days settled into a gentle rhythm at the homestead. Each morning, Abby woke to roosters crowing and the soft sounds of Dakota already at work outside. The familiar tasks of keeping house anchored her in this new life, giving structure to her days. She found comfort in the simplest chores. The wooden handle of the water bucket felt solid in her grip as she made trips to and from the stream. The rhythmic kneading of bread dough beneath her hands soothed her racing thoughts. Even feeding the handful of chickens that scratched in. The yard brought a sense of purpose. Their eager clucking made her smile despite herself. From the kitchen window, she watched Dakota working. His powerful frame moved with deliberate grace as he repaired the corrals, clearing away dead brush and replacing rotted posts. Sometimes he would call her outside, asking her to hand him tools or hold a board steady. Their fingers would brush. Briefly during these moments, and though Abby still felt shy, the tension between them had begun to ease. Their conversations grew more natural, too. Dakota spoke of the land seasons, teaching her to read the signs of weather in wind and cloud. Abby found herself sharing small stories from her childhood, memories of her mother's garden, songs from church, the taste of wild berries in summer. Dakota listened with quiet interest, as if each detail mattered. On the evening of the third day, the air grew thick and heavy. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, stacking high against the dimming sky. The wind picked up suddenly, making the cabin's shutters rattle against their hinges. Abby jumped at the first crack of thunder. She had always feared storms, ever since lightning had struck their barn when she was small. The flash and boom reminded her, too, much of her father's unpredictable rages. Rain began hammering the cabin roof as she huddled closer to the hearth fire. Each thunderclap made her flinch. Dakota moved from the window where he'd been watching. The storm's approach. Without a word, he settled beside her on the floor, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "The storms that sweep these plains are powerful," he said, his deep voice steady beneath the thunder's roll. "But they bring life with them. The rain feeds the streams, makes the grass grow thick for the buffalo. Lightning clears dead wood, lets new things grow." Another flash lit the cabin. Abby instinctively pressed closer to Dakota's side. This time, he lifted his arm, allowing her to lean against his shoulder. His strength felt like shelter. "My people say storms cleanse the earth," he continued. "They wash away what is old and damaged, make room for new beginnings." His hand rested lightly on her back, warm and reassuring. "Like the earth, sometimes we need storms to heal." They sat like that as the tempest raged, Dakota's quiet voice weaving stories of plains and people, of survival and renewal. Gradually, Abby's trembling eased. The thunder became just thunder, not the echo of old fears. As the storm began to subside, rain softening to a gentle patter, Dakota fell silent. When he spoke again, his voice held a different weight. "After I lost my wife and son," he said slowly, "I made a vow never to love again. The pain was too great. I thought my heart would stay frozen like winter ground." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But when I saw you that day, standing on those wooden boards like a wounded deer before hunters, something broke inside me. The ice cracked. I knew the Creator had sent me to you." Abby's breath caught in her throat. She remained very still against his shoulder, barely daring to move. "I'm afraid," she whispered finally. "Not of you, but my father always said I was worthless, too big, too quiet, too much trouble to feed. What if he was right? What if I can't be what you need?" Dakota's hand tightened slightly on her back. "Worth is not given by men," he said firmly. "It is given by God. Your father's words were poison arrows meant to wound your spirit, but they were lies." Tears slid down Abby's cheeks, soaking into Dakota's shirt. He held her gently, letting her cry. Outside, the storm's last rumbles faded into the distance. The fire had burned low when Abby's tears finally stopped. She felt drained but somehow lighter, as if the storm had indeed washed something away. Her eyes grew heavy as Dakota's warmth, and the rain's soft melody surrounded her. For the first time since her mother's death, Abby felt truly safe. As sleep claimed her, she realized she was no longer the frightened girl from the auction block. Like the prairie after the storm, something new was taking root in her heart. The eastern sky blushed pink as Dakota hitched his Mustang to the wagon. Abby wrapped her shawl tighter against the dawn chill, watching him check the leather straps with careful hands. They needed supplies: flour, sugar, salt, and other basics to keep the cabin stocked. Though her heart fluttered at the thought of returning to town, she knew they couldn't avoid it forever. Dakota helped her onto the wooden seat, his touch gentle but sure. The wagon creaked as he settled beside her, taking up the reins. In the early light, his profile was strong against the lightning horizon. Without a word, he clicked to the horse, and they set off down the rutted trail toward town. The sun had fully risen by the time the first buildings came into view. Abby's hands twisted in her lap as they approached. Already, she could see people stopping to stare, women on porches pausing in their sweeping, men gathered outside the barbershop turning to watch as they rolled down the main street, dust puffing. Beneath the wagon wheels, whispers followed them like shadows. Abby caught fragments of conversation that made her cheeks burn. Apache pride, thinking he can just, that Johnson girl, living out there with him, ain't natural, mixing like that. Women who had known her since childhood quickly averted their eyes when she looked their way. Others peered from behind curtains, not bothering to hide their disapproval. Dakota sat straight back beside her, his face impassive, though Abby sensed his awareness of every muttered word. They stopped outside the mercantile. Dakota stepped down first, then reached up to help Abby from the wagon. His hands were steady on her waist, grounding her against the stairs that seemed to press from all sides. The store's bell jangled as they entered. Inside, the familiar smell of coffee beans and leather goods wrapped around them. Abby moved carefully between the barrels and shelves, selecting what they needed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she measured flour into a sack. Sugar next, then salt. Each item felt like a small victory against the watchful silence of the store. Behind the counter, Mr. Peterson's eyes darted between them as Dakota counted out cash. The shopkeeper's hesitation was plain on his face as he stared at the money. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he reached for the bills. Just then, the door burst open. Abby's heart seized as her father stumbled in, reeking of whiskey despite the early hour. His bloodshot eyes fixed on her with savage intensity. "There's my lying daughter," he slurred, pointing an unsteady finger. "And her thieving Indian. Thought you could shame me, did you? Spreading tales about carrying his child?" Abby shrank back, old terror rising in her throat. But before her father could take another step, Dakota moved. Without aggression, he placed himself between them, his broad shoulders forming a wall of protection. His stance was calm but unmovable. "You will not touch her," Dakota said quietly. Her father's face twisted with rage. "She's my flesh, my property. You stole her with your heathen lies." "That's enough, John Johnson." Sheriff Cole's voice cut through the tension as he appeared in the doorway, hand resting on his holstered gun. "Back away now, before you do something you'll regret. You taking their side, Sheriff?" Her father's words dripped venom. "Letting savages steal our women?" "I'm keeping the peace," the sheriff replied evenly. "And right now, you're disturbing it. Go sleep it off." For a moment, it seemed her father might lunge at them anyway. But the sheriff's steady gaze and Dakota's silent strength seemed to deflate him. With a final curse, he staggered out, leaving. The store thick with uncomfortable silence. Mr. Peterson hurriedly finished their transaction, practically pushing their purchases across the counter. Dakota gathered their supplies with deliberate calm, his movements unhurried despite the tension. Abby followed him out, feeling the weight of watching eyes on her back. The ride home seemed longer than the morning's journey. Abby sat rigid beside Dakota, shame burning in her chest. The gentle sway of the wagon and the steady clip of hooves gradually carried them away from town, but she couldn't shake the memory of her father's accusations, the townspeople's judgment. It wasn't until they were safely back at the cabin, supplies stored away and evening settling around them, that Abby finally broke. She sank into a chair, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sorry you had to shield me. Sorry for the scene. Sorry for," her voice caught, "for being connected to such a man." Dakota knelt before her chair, his dark eyes finding hers. "Your father's words are like dust in the wind," he said firmly. "They have no power here. You are not his property. You are my wife, chosen by the Chidin Creator." His certainty wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Abby wiped her eyes, drawing a shaky breath. "How can you be so sure? About anything?" "Because I listened to the Spirit," he replied simply. "And the Spirit does not lie." Later that night, after Dakota had banked the fire, Abby knelt beside their bed. It had been years since she'd prayed properly. Her father's cruelty had poisoned even that. But now, in the quiet darkness, words came softly. "Thank you," she whispered to the listening night, "for sending me a protector, for his patience, for giving me hope again." Her hands clasped tightly as she felt something stir in her heart. A flutter of faith she thought had died with her mother. It was small, like a newly sprouted seed, but it was there. Rising from her knees, Abby felt steadier. The day's shame seemed to recede, replaced by a growing certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days flowed like water in the stream behind their cabin, each one bringing small changes that smoothed the rough edges between them. Mornings found Abby at the cook stove while Dakota tended the horses, the rhythm of their lives settling into something comfortable and true. One afternoon, Abby sat cross-legged on their small porch, wrestling with needle and thread. She'd found an old shirt of Dakota's with a torn sleeve and decided to prove herself useful. The result was less than perfect. "I believe," Dakota said, examining her crooked stitches with twinkling eyes, "the tear was smaller before you tried to fix it." Abby looked at the mangled sleeve and burst into laughter, real laughter that bubbled up from deep inside. "Oh dear," she managed between giggles. "I've made it worse, haven't I?" Dakota's deep chuckle joined hers. Perhaps the shirt wanted to be a vest all along. His gentle teasing warmed her heart. Just days ago, she would have cringed at such failure, expecting harsh words. But Dakota's humor helped her see the joy in imperfection. The next morning, it was Dakota's turn to hide a smile when Abby's bread came out of the oven heavy as a stone. "It could be useful," he suggested, weighing the dense loaf in his hand. "Perhaps to hold down the roof in strong winds?" Abby put her hands on her hips, in mock offense. "Well then, you can eat your own cooking tomorrow." No, he said quickly, breaking off a piece. "I prefer my food to be substantial." His deadpan delivery sent them both into fits of laughter again. These moments of shared mirth were healing something in Abby she hadn't known was broken. Her ability to find joy in simple things died as evening approached. They sat by the fire as usual, but tonight felt different. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as Abby gathered her courage. She'd been humming hymns under her breath all week, but tonight she wanted to sing properly, something she hadn't done since her mother passed. "Would you?" She hesitated, then pressed on. "Would you mind if I sang?" Dakota nodded encouragement, his eyes warm in the FIRELIGT. Abby closed her eyes and began singing Amazing Grace, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each verse. The familiar words filled their small cabin with something holy. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." When she opened her eyes, she saw tears tracking down Dakota's cheeks. His usual stoic expression had crumbled, revealing raw grief beneath. "Dakota?" she whispered, alarmed. "My wife," he said softly. "She used to sing to our son each night. Different words, different tune, but the same spirit in it." His voice caught. She would hold him close and sing of the stars, of the wind, of the Creator's love. Without thinking, Abby reached for his hand. He gripped it tightly, drawing strength from her touch. "Tell me about them?" she asked gently. Dakota's thumb traced circles on her palm as he spoke. "My son had just learned to walk. Such a determined little one, always trying to keep up with me." A sad smile touched his lips. "My wife was like you, gentle but strong inside. She could quiet a spooked horse with just her presence." "What happened?" Abby asked, though she feared she knew. "Soldiers came at dawn," he said, his voice hollow, with old pain. "They said we were on white man's land, though our people had camped there for generations. There was no warning, no chance to explain." He fell silent, lost in memory. Abby squeezed his hand, offering what comfort she could. They sat that way for a long while, connected in the firelight, sharing the weight of loss. Finally, Dakota spoke. Again, "I thought my heart would stay bitter forever. But the Creator had other plans." His eyes met hers with profound gratitude. "He sent me you." The tenderness in his voice made Abby's heart swell. This man who had suffered so much still had room in his heart for kindness, for hope, for her. She realized with sudden clarity that what she felt for him had grown beyond gratitude or friendship. Love had crept in quietly, taking root in the fertile soil of trust he'd cultivated. As the fire burned lower, their conversation turned to the future. Dakota spoke of expanding the cornfield, of building a proper barn. Abby shared her dream of having a vegetable garden, maybe some fruit trees. "And children?" Dakota asked softly. "Do you still fear that vision?" Abby touched her middle, thinking. How different she felt now about the possibility of motherhood. "No," she answered truthfully, "not anymore. This body that I was always told was wrong, maybe it's exactly right for bringing new life." Dakota smiled. "You begin to see yourself as the Creator sees you, a vessel of hope, a bearer of future generations who might bridge the gap between our peoples. Do you really think that's possible?" she asked. "Peace between white and Apache? The Creator would not plant such love in our hearts if there was no hope for peace," he answered. Every child born of such unions is a promise of better days. Later that night, lying in their shared bed, though they had not yet come together as husband and wife, Abby whispered his name into the darkness. Dakota? Yes? I'm glad you found me. I'm glad you knew to claim me that day. His hand found hers in the dark. I'm glad you were brave enough to trust me. Abby smiled in the darkness, marveling at how her fear of this man had transformed into something so different, a longing to know him fully, to share everything with him, to build a life that would honor both their peoples. She fell asleep still holding his hand, dreaming of gardens and children and peace. Morning dew sparkled on the grass as Abby hung laundry behind the cabin. The past weeks had been peaceful, but something in the air felt different today. A restlessness like the kind that came before a storm. She paused, holding one of Dakota's shirts against her chest, watching dust rise from the road that led to town. 4 riders approached, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds in the dry earth. These weren't the usual townfolk. Their suits were too fine, their boots too polished. Railroad men. Abby's heart skipped a beat as they passed the cabin without a glance, heading straight for town. Later that morning, Abby hitched the wagon to make her weekly trip to the mercantile. Dakota was out mending fences, and they needed flour and coffee. As she approached town, she noticed clusters of people talking in low voices, falling silent when she passed. Inside the mercantile, Abby kept her head down, gathering supplies. But voices carried from the back room, where the door stood slightly ajar. She recognized her father's slurred speech. "Ain't natural, them being together," he was saying. "Railroad man got the right of it." A smooth voice responded, one of the suited men from earlier. "We understand your position, Mr. Johnson. The company is prepared to make it worth your while. Whiskey, cash, whatever you need to set the record straight about this unfortunate situation. Worth my while, you say?" Her father's voice turned greedy. "Well then, I reckon I could tell folks how that Apache forced himself on my girl. How the marriage ain't proper at all." Abby's hands trembled so badly she dropped the flour sack. Dust puffed up around her feet as her stomach twisted into knots. The shopkeeper's wife saw her face go pale and touched her arm. "Best hurry home." "Dear," the woman whispered, "trouble's brewing." Abby drove the wagon home as fast as she dared, tears blurring her vision. When she told Dakota what she'd overheard, he simply nodded, as if he'd been expecting this. "The railroad wants this land," he said quietly. "They will use any excuse to take it." As evening approached, they heard horses approaching, many of them. Abby peered through the window and counted at least 15 riders gathering in the yard. Some held torches that flickered in the growing darkness. Her father was among them, swaying in his saddle. "Apache thief." Someone shouted, "Come out and face us." "Show yourself, redskin." Another voice called, "We know what you did." Dakota stood calmly, straightening his shirt. "Stay inside," he told Abby softly. "No," she clutched his arm. "Please don't go out there." He cupped her face in his hands. "Trust in the Creator," he sighed. "All will be well." Dakota stepped onto the porch, his presence commanding even in the torchlight. "You are trespassing," he said, voice carrying clearly across the yard. "This is my land and my wife's land. Leave now." More riders appeared, including Sheriff Cole. The lawman looked uncomfortable, but his hand rested on his gun belt. "Dakota," the sheriff called out, "these men have brought serious charges against you. They say you forced this marriage under false pretenses to steal land that's meant for the railroad." "That's a lie." Abby burst out onto the porch, unable to stay silent. "He saved me. He's my husband." Her father spurred his horse forward. She's addled in the head. This savage tricked her, claimed she was carrying his child to force the marriage. "Is this true?" the sheriff asked Abby directly. "Were you with child when you married?" Abby's face burned with shame. "No, but then the marriage was based on fraud." One of the railroad men cut in smoothly. "The town must protect its interests." "Sheriff, do your duty." Sheriff Cole dismounted slowly, pulling iron shackles from his saddlebag. "Dakota, you're under arrest for fraudulent marriage and deception of the court." "No." Abby threw herself between them. "Sheriff Cole, please." "You." "No, this isn't right." The sheriff wouldn't meet her eyes. "Step aside, Mrs. Johnson." That's not my name anymore, Abby said fiercely. I'm Mrs. Dakota now, and I won't let you take him. Dakota gently moved her aside. Do not make this harder, he murmured. I will not have violence at our home. Tears streamed down Abby's face. As the sheriff approached with the shackles, Dakota held out his wrists without resistance, dignity intact even as the iron closed around his skin. What about our land? Abby asked desperately. Our home? The railroad has rightful claim now. One of the suited men said, This marriage is void. You'll be returned to your father's custody. No, Abby whispered, but Dakota was already being led to the sheriff's horse. He turned back to her, eyes full of love and sorrow. Taking her hand, he pressed his lips to it in a gesture of tender farewell. Keep faith, he whispered. Remember what I taught you about strength. The sheriff mounted up, keeping tight hold of the chains that bound Dakota. The group of riders formed up around them, torches casting wild shadows in the darkness. Abby watched helplessly as they rode away, taking her heart with them. When the last rider disappeared into the night, Abby's legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees in the dirt, clutching the porch post for support. The cabin that had become her sanctuary now felt empty, echoing with absence. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that matched the desolation in her soul. She stayed there until the moon rose, unable to move, unable to accept that everything she and Dakota had built together could be torn apart so easily by greed and lies. Finally, as the night air grew cold, she forced herself to stand. Dakota would want her to be strong. Somehow, she had to find a way to fight for him, for their love, for the truth. But for now, all she could do was stumble inside their quiet home and pray. Pray for justice, pray for courage, and pray for the return of the man who had taught her what real love looked like. The cabin felt hollow without Dakota's presence. Abby huddled by the dying fire, watching shadows dance across the walls. Her tears had dried into salty tracks on her cheeks, but the ache in her chest remained sharp and constant. Worth is not given by men, it is given by God. Dakota's words echoed in her mind as she stared into the dimming embers. He had seen value in her when no one else did, had lifted her from shame to dignity. Now he sat in a jail cell because of lies and greed. The fire sputtered and went out, leaving only moonlight streaming through the window. Abby wrapped herself in the blanket Dakota had given her on their wedding night, breathing in his lingering scent of leather and sage. Sleep eluded her as she watched the stars wheel across the sky through the cabin's small window dot as the first gray light of dawn crept over the horizon. Abby rose from her bed. Her movements were stiff but determined as she pulled on her dress and boots. Outside, dew sparkled on the grass as she made her way to the lean-to where Dakota kept his Mustang. The horse nickered softly as she approached. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the saddle. It was heavy, but she managed to secure it just as Dakota had taught her. The horse stood patient and steady, sensing perhaps that this morning was different. The ride into town was slow, but steady. Abby's heart pounded harder with each hoofbeat that brought her closer to the jailhouse. The streets were quiet in the early morning light, though a few early risers paused to stare as she rode past. Sheriff Cole was already at his desk when she entered the jailhouse. He looked up from his paperwork, his expression guarded. Mrs. Johnson, he began. Mrs. Dakota, Abby corrected firmly, though her voice shook. I've come about my husband. The sheriff sighed, setting down his pen. There's nothing to discuss. The railroad has filed formal charges. Please, Abby stepped closer to his desk. Our marriage vows were true. We stood before God and made promises to each other. That means something. It means nothing if the marriage was based on fraud, Sheriff Cole replied, not unkindly. He claimed you were with child when you weren't. He saved me from being sold like an animal, Abby's voice rose. He gave me a home, showed me kindness, taught me my own worth. That's the truth. The truth is, the sheriff lowered his voice, the railroad wants that land. They've got powerful friends. My hands are tied. Through the window, Abby could see people gathering outside, drawn by the sound of raised voices. Their whispers carried through the thin walls. Poor thing, moon-eyed over that Apache. Ought to be grateful she's free of him. Never should have let them marry in the first place. Abby's cheeks burned, but she held her head high as she left. The jailhouse. The crowd parted before her, their judgment heavy in their stares. Her feet carried her to the church, the only place she could think to go. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows as Abby fell to her knees at the altar. Her prayers came out in broken sobs. Please, God, give me strength. Show me how to help him. I can't lose him. A hand touched her shoulder gently. Abby looked up to see Mrs. Peterson, one of the older church ladies who had helped with her wedding. The woman's weathered face was kind. Child, Mrs. Peterson said softly, truth has power if you speak it. The Lord gives voice to those who stand. For what's right, Abby wiped her eyes. But who will listen? They've all made up their minds about us. Then make them hear you, Mrs. Peterson squeezed her shoulder. Sunday service is tomorrow. The whole town will be here to hear Reverend Brooks speak about this situation. That's your chance to testify. Hope flickered in Abby's chest, small but bright. She nodded slowly, rising to her feet. Thank you, she whispered. That evening, Abby sat at the cabin's small table with paper and pencil. The lamplight was dim, but her purpose was clear as she began to write. Hours passed as she poured out her heart, the shame of nearly being sold, the dignity Dakota had shown her, the gentle way he had taught her to ride and tend the land. She wrote of their shared prayers, their growing love, the peace she had found in their simple life together. Her hand cramped and her eyes grew tired, but still she wrote. When she finished, Abby read the words aloud to the empty cabin, her voice growing stronger with each line. It wasn't elegant or flowery, but it was honest. She prayed it would be enough. In the darkness before dawn, Abby knelt again by her bed. Fear still fluttered in her stomach at the thought of speaking before the whole town, but underneath it was a steady current of determination. She felt God's presence wrapping around her like a warm blanket, giving her the courage she would need. Lord, she prayed softly, help me speak your truth. Help me be strong like Dakota taught me. Help me fight for our love. Our love. As she rose from her knees, Abby caught sight of herself in the small mirror Dakota had hung for her. The woman looking back was different from the scared girl who had stood on that auction block. Her eyes were clear and purposeful, her chin lifted with quiet dignity. Tomorrow she would stand before the town and defend her husband. Tomorrow she would give voice to their love. Tomorrow, by God's grace, truth would triumph over lies. But tonight, she held her testimony close to her heart and watched the stars through the window, knowing that somewhere in his cell, Dakota could see those same stars. Their love was as real as those distant lights, and she would not let it be extinguished by darkness. The autumn morning dawned with crystalline clarity, painting the prairie sky in delicate shades of pink and gold. A cool breeze rustled the tall grass around the church as Abby approached, her testimony paper clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The white clapboard building stood against the sky like a sentinel, its bell tower reaching toward heaven. Church bell began to toll, deep and resonant, calling the faithful to worship. One by one, townsfolk made their way up the wooden steps, their Sunday best contrasting sharply with the dust of the street. Abby could hear their whispers as she drew near, could feel their sideways glances burning into her back. Did you hear? She means to speak today. The nerve of that girl, defending an Apache. Railroad men won't stand for this. Abby's legs felt wooden as she climbed the church steps, but she held her chin high, just as Dakota had taught her. Inside, the familiar scents of beeswax candles and old hymnals wrapped around her. Sunlight streamed through the simple stained glass windows, casting pools of colored light across the wooden pews. She chose a seat near the back, away from the curious stares. As the congregation settled, the rustle of skirts and creak of leather boots filled the air. Reverend Brooks stepped to the pulpit, his expression grave as he surveyed his flock. Brothers and sisters, he began, we gather today in troubled times. Abby's heart thundered in her chest as she rose to her feet. Reverend Brooks, she called out, her voice wavering but clear. If you please, I wish to speak. A collective gasp rippled through the church. Heads turned, necks craned to stare at her. Reverend Brooks paused, his sermon forgotten as he regarded her with surprise. This is most irregular, Miss Johnson. Mrs. Dakota, she corrected gently, already moving toward the front. Her legs trembled with each step, but she forced herself forward. The paper in her hands crinkled as she gripped it tighter. Standing before the congregation, Abby felt small and exposed. The faces before her were a sea of judgment and curiosity. She unfolded her testimony with shaking fingers, then set it aside. These words needed to come from her heart. "Many of you were there that day," she began, her voice growing stronger. "The day my father dragged me to the auction block like I was no more than cattle. You saw him, drunk and cruel, trying to sell his own daughter for whiskey money." The church grew so quiet she could hear the wind sighing through the eaves. Mrs. Peterson, sitting in the front row, nodded encouragingly. "I had known nothing but shame and cruelty," Abby continued, tears pricking at her eyes. But then Dakota stepped forward. "He didn't just save me from humiliation. He gave me dignity. He showed me what it means to be valued, to be protected, to be loved." She straightened her shoulders, looking directly at those who had whispered against her marriage. "The railroad men claim our marriage is a fraud. They say Dakota only wanted the land. But I tell you now, before God and this congregation, our marriage is sacred and true." Her voice rose with conviction. "In our cabin, I learned what family really means. Dakota taught me to ride, to tend the land, to hold my head high. He never raised his voice or his hand to me. He prays with me, shares his stories with me, treats me with gentleness and respect." Tears were flowing freely now, but Abby didn't wipe them away. "The railroad can spread their lies, but they cannot touch the truth in my heart. Dakota is my husband, chosen by God to save me, to love me, to show me my own worth." The silence that followed her words felt heavy as lead. Then, slowly, Mrs. Peterson rose from her seat. Her weathered face was wet with tears as she turned to face the congregation. "I helped dress this girl for her wedding," she declared. I saw the fear in her eyes turn to hope when Dakota spoke his vows. "Will we now stand silent while men with money tear apart what God has joined?" Another woman stood, then another. Soon, a dozen of the older church women were on their feet. Mrs. Peterson's voice rang out clear and strong. "We will not see this girl shamed again." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the church. Reverend Brooks stepped forward, laying a gentle hand on Abby's shoulder. "I performed their marriage ceremony," he announced. "I saw the sacred nature of their bond. While some questioned my decision then, I stand by it now. Their union was made before God, and it is valid in His eyes and mine." The congregation broke into hushed discussion. Some nodded in approval, while others sat in thoughtful silence. The railroad men's lies seemed to lose their power in the face of Abby's honest testimony. Relief flooded through Abby's body, making her knees weak. She had done it. She had found her voice at last. The truth had been spoken, and it could not be unspoken. As she returned to her seat, supported by Mrs. Peterson's steady arm, Abby felt the weight of silence lifting from her shoulders. Her words, so long trapped inside, had finally taken flight. Now they would work their way through the town, challenging the lies, defending love, demanding justice. The rest of the service passed in a blur of hymns and prayers. But something had shifted in that sacred space. The whispers had changed from condemnation to compassion, from judgment to justice. Abby sat straight and tall, feeling stronger than she ever had before. She had testified to the power of love before God and her neighbors. Now she could only pray that her words would help bring Dakota home. Word of Abby's testimony raced through the town like wildfire. By early afternoon, a crowd had gathered outside the jailhouse, their murmurs carrying on the autumn breeze. The shadows were growing long when Sheriff Cole finally approached the iron-barred door, keys jangling in his weathered hands. Inside the dim cell, Dakota sat straight-backed on the narrow cot, his dignity undiminished by imprisonment. The sheriff cleared his throat, metal scraping against metal as he worked the lock. "Your wife spoke at church this morning," Sheriff Cole said, his voice gruff but respectful. "Never heard anything like it. That girl of yours stood before God and everybody, told the whole truth about what happened. Made quite an impression on folks." The heavy door creaked open. "You're free to go. Town's convinced your marriage is genuine. Even the preacher vouched for you both." Dakota rose in one fluid motion, ducking his head slightly to clear the doorframe. His dark eyes held no anger, only quiet strength as he nodded to the sheriff. "Thank you." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street. Abby stood waiting, her plain dress whipping in the prairie wind, her face glowing with joy and relief. The moment Dakota appeared in the doorway, she rushed forward. In 2 long strides, he met her. His powerful arms swept around her waist, lifting her clean off her feet in an embrace that spoke of longing and reunion. Abby's laugh rang out, clear and bright, as she wrapped her arms around his neck. For a moment, they were lost in their own world, heedless of the watching crowd. "I knew you would come," Dakota murmured against her hair. "I couldn't let them take you from me," Abby whispered back, tears sparkling in her eyes. He set her gently on her feet but kept one arm protectively around her waist. The townspeople watched with varying expressions. Some smiled in approval, others looked away uncomfortably, but none dared voice opposition. From the shadows of the saloon, Abby's father emerged, whiskey bottle in hand. His bloodshot eyes narrowed at the sight of them together. He spat in the dirt, a gesture of pure contempt. "Ain't natural," he slurred. "Ain't right." But his words fell flat in the afternoon air. The townsfolk who had once enabled his cruelty now turned their backs, moving away from his drunken stance. Even his drinking companions abandoned him, leaving him swaying alone in the street. After a moment, he stumbled back into the saloon's dark interior, defeated and diminished. The railroad men stood in a tight cluster near the telegraph office, their fine suits dusty from the prairie wind. Their faces were thunderous with barely contained rage as they watched their careful scheme crumble. The tallest one, a man with cold eyes and a silver watch chain, made as if to approach, but Sheriff Cole's steady gaze stopped him short. Abby and Dakota began their walk through town, hands clasped together. They moved with unhurried dignity, their faces lifted to the golden afternoon light. Where once they might have hurried past the stairs and whispers, now they walked with measured steps. Unashamed. Mrs. Peterson emerged from the mercantile, nodding approvingly as they passed. "Bless you both," she called softly. Other women joined her, offering small smiles or quiet words of support. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The town's judgment had shifted, shaped by Abby's brave testimony and the undeniable truth of their love. As they reached the edge of town, Dakota helped Abby mount his waiting Mustang. The horse nickered softly, recognizing its riders. They rode double through the waving grass, the setting sun painting the prairie in shades of amber and rose. The cabin appeared as twilight gathered, smoke rising straight and true from the chimney, where Abby had kept the hearth fire burning in hope of his return. Inside, the familiar sense of home welcomed them: wood smoke, dried herbs, fresh bread cooling on the table. Abby moved about the kitchen with practiced grace, preparing a simple supper while Dakota tended to the horse. When he returned, they sat together at the rough-hewn table, their meal blessed by companionable silence. As they finished eating, Abby's hands trembled slightly as she gathered the tin plates. "I was so afraid," she admitted quietly. "When they took you away, I thought I might never see you again." Dakota rose and gently took the plates from her shaking hands, setting them aside. His dark eyes were soft with tenderness as he looked at her. "You are my strength now," he said simply. "Your courage brought me home." The fire crackled low in the hearth as they settled on the floor before it, Abby leaning back against Dakota's broad chest. His arms encircled her, strong and sure, as the flames cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls. No words were needed in that peaceful moment. Their bond had been tested in fire and emerged stronger, sealed not just by their wedding vows but by the trials they had faced together. Abby's quiet humming filled the air, a hymn of gratitude rising naturally from her heart. Dakota's hand found hers in the firelight, their fingers intertwining. Outside, coyotes called to one another across the darkening prairie, but within the cabin walls, all was warmth and certainty and love. Autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and russet as the weeks flowed quietly past. The town's cold shoulder gradually thawed, like spring ice melting in the creek. One crisp morning, a knock at the cabin door startled Abby from her baking. She opened it to find Mrs. Peterson and 3 other churchwomen standing there, arms laden with quilts and fresh-baked bread. "We thought you might need these," Mrs. Peterson said warmly, spreading a star-patterned quilt across Abby's bed. "Winter's coming, and every home needs proper blankets." The women stayed for tea, their initial awkwardness dissolving as they shared recipes and gentle advice. Their visits became regular, bringing not just goods but acceptance and friendship. Each time they came, the cabin felt more blessed. Down by the creek, Dakota worked the rich soil, his strong hands guiding the plow through dark earth. Corn and beans sprouted in neat rows, reaching toward the sun. He had chosen the spot carefully, where the water ran sweet and clear all year round. Sometimes Abby would bring him water, watching with pride as he built their future, row by row. On days filled with purpose. The chicken coop rang with happy clucking as she gathered eggs each morning. Along the cabin's south wall, herb garden flourished, sage, mint, and rosemary perfuming the air. She learned to dry the herbs in bundles, hanging them from the rafters like fragrant memories. Laughter came easier now. Abby's fingers grew steadier with the needle as she practiced her sewing, though sometimes her seam still wandered like creek water. Dakota would hold up her latest attempt at a shirt, eyes twinkling as he teased, "Maybe. Good for Scarecrow?" She gave it right back, especially when her biscuits came out heavy as stones. "Perfect for throwing at coyotes," she'd say, and his deep chuckle would fill the cabin with warmth. One evening, as lamplight cast soft shadows on the walls, Abby set down her mending. Her hand drifted to her middle, where she had noticed changes. "Dakota," she whispered, I think I'm carrying our child." He looked up sharply, hope blazing in his dark eyes. Without a word, he crossed to her and knelt, his large hands gentle as they covered hers. "Thank you, Creator," he prayed aloud, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for this blessing." Abby's eyes filled with tears as he gathered her close. They held each other in the warm circle of lamplight, overwhelmed by the miracle growing between them. His prophecy on that long-ago day by the auction block had come true. She would indeed bear his son. Later, as crickets sang their evening chorus outside, they lay talking softly of the future. Their child would know both worlds, would learn both the old hymns Abby loved and the sacred stories of Dakota's people. They would teach him or her to walk in both traditions with pride and grace. Abby rested her head on Dakota's chest, listening to his steady heartbeat. The cabin that had once felt so strange and lonely now pulsed with life and love. Every corner held memories, every beam and board had become home. As their child grew, beneath her heart, so too grew their joy, deep-rooted as the corn by the creek, reaching ever upward toward tomorrow. Autumn swept across the prairie, painting the tall grass in shades of amber and gold. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Abby rocked slowly on the cabin's front porch, her hands resting on her swollen belly. She watched Dakota in the distance, his strong figure moving steadily through the cornfield as he checked the ripening ears. The creak of wagon wheels drew her attention. Mrs. Peterson and 3 other churchwomen approached, their faces bright with welcome. They carried baskets overflowing with fresh bread, preserves, and carefully folded cloth for baby clothes. "We brought you some things, Mrs." Peterson said warmly, setting her basket beside Abby's chair. "Every new mother needs help getting ready." Tears welled in Abby's eyes as she touched the soft fabric. "I never thought," she began, her voice catching. "I mean, after everything." "Hush now," Mrs. Peterson said, patting her shoulder. "You're one of us, dear. Both of you are." The women stayed through the afternoon, sharing stories and wisdom about motherhood. Their laughter drifted across the yard, reaching Dakota as he worked. He looked up occasionally, nodding in quiet satisfaction at the sight of his wife surrounded by friends. As evening approached, the churchwomen departed with promises to return soon. Dakota gathered firewood while Abby prepared their supper, moving carefully with her growing burden. The familiar routine felt sacred now, blessed by the life they'd built together. Later, as flames danced in the hearth, Abby began to sing. Her voice, once timid and uncertain, rose clear and strong in the old hymn her mother had taught her. The melody filled their home with peace. To her surprise, Dakota's deep voice joined hers, weaving harmony through the verses. Their voices blended like streams joining into a river. When the song ended, they sat close together, watching the fire. "What do you think our child will be like?" Abby asked softly. Dakota's hand covered hers where it rested on her belly. "Strong," he said, "strong in spirit like the mother." Abby leaned against him, remembering that terrible day on the auction block, how small and worthless she had felt. Now she sat in her own home, cherished by a good man, carrying their child beneath her heart. The transformation seemed almost too beautiful to believe. "No one will ever call you worthless again," Dakota whispered, as if reading her thoughts. His arm tightened protectively around her shoulders. She smiled, feeling their baby move within her. "God had a plan," she said, even when I couldn't see it. Outside, night settled over the prairie like a soft blanket. Their cabin glowed warm. Against the darkness, windows bright with lamplight and hope. Inside, Abby and Dakota held each other close, their hearts full of gratitude for the love that had redeemed them both. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.